Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story. This whole mess started when I finally saved up enough to buy a house in what seemed like the perfect suburban neighborhood. After months of house hunting and getting outbid on everything decent, I found this beautiful 3-bedroom home with the most amazing feature. A huge, gorgeously landscaped backyard that was basically my dream come true. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, and my backyard opened up to this massive shared green space that the HOA maintained as a community park. There wasn't even a fence between my yard and the park, just some nice shrubs and little property markers. The elderly couple who owned it before me had apparently rarely used the yard, so it was perfectly maintained but felt like this untapped paradise just waiting for someone to enjoy it. I work from home doing IT consulting, so I was around the house most days. The peace and quiet was exactly what I needed after years of cramped apartment living. I'm generally a pretty laid-back person who minds their own business, but I also believe strongly in standing up for what's right when push comes to shove. Everything was perfect for the first few weeks. I spent my mornings with coffee on the back patio, planning out where I wanted to add some flower beds and maybe a vegetable garden. I was living the suburban dream until I met the neighborhood's self-appointed queen bee. Her name was unfortunately actually Susan, but everyone called her by her preferred title as head of the HOA Beautification Committee. She lived 2 houses down and had apparently designated herself as the neighborhood's aesthetic police. This woman was always power walking around the area in expensive workout clothes, carrying either a clipboard or her phone, making what she clearly thought were very important calls about community standards. The first time I saw her, she was standing in my backyard with a tape measure. I was in my home office when I noticed someone walking around outside my window. At first I thought maybe it was a utility worker or something, but when I looked closer, there was this woman in bright pink athletic wear systematically measuring the distance between my rose bushes. She had this air of complete authority, like she owned the place. I went outside to politely ask what was going on, thinking maybe there was some kind of community project I hadn't heard about. Boy, was I wrong. She looked up from her measuring tape and gave me this condescending smile. She explained that my backyard was apparently a critical visual anchor for the entire shared park area. According to her, the previous owners had given her complete control over their landscaping decisions to ensure everything met her high standards for the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. Then she handed me a printed list of approved perennial flowers and informed me that the azaleas I had just spent $300 planting were tacky and needed to be removed immediately. I stood there holding this list of approved flowers for my own garden, handed to me by a woman who was trespassing on my property. I tried to be nice about it, but I had no idea this was just the first step in her plan to basically annex my entire backyard. I thanked her for her input, but firmly explained that I would be managing my own landscaping decisions. I told her that while I certainly appreciated wanting to keep the neighborhood looking nice, my yard was my private property, and I had every right to plant whatever I wanted within reason. You would have thought I told her to burn down the community center. Her face went red and she got this look like I had personally insulted her family. She scoffed and said we'd see what the HOA had to say about my attitude. She made some snide comment about how I clearly didn't understand how things worked in an established neighborhood like this one. Before she left, she made this passive-aggressive remark about my starter home and how she hoped I'd eventually learn to appreciate the community standards that kept property values high. She even glanced at my car and made some comment about hoping I'd upgrade that too once I got more established. I should have realized right then that this woman was going to make my life hell. A few days later, I found an official HOA violation notice tucked into my front door. The violation was listed as improperly maintained transition from private to communal space, which was so vague it was basically meaningless. I read through it 3 times trying to figure out what exactly I was supposed to have done wrong. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to contest the violation. Big mistake. The meeting was held in the community center, and of course Susan was running the show as head of the beautification committee. The moment I tried to explain my position, she steamrolled right over me with this long speech about community standards and property values. The other board members were clearly her friends and nodded along with everything she said. When I tried to point out that my property was private and the violation notice was extremely vague, she cut me off and said the matter was settled. They voted to uphold the violation and gave me 30 days to comply with their landscaping requirements. I left that meeting feeling frustrated but figured I'd just ignore their ridiculous demands. After all, what were they really going to do to me? I found out the hard way when I came home from running errands the following week to discover Susan had hired someone to dig up my azaleas. There was this guy with a shovel actively removing the plants I had just paid good money for and spent hours carefully planting. When I confronted her about it, she acted like she was doing me some huge favor. She said she was upgrading my landscaping to meet community standards and would send me the bill for the improvements. The audacity was unbelievable. I told the worker to stop immediately and informed Susan that she was trespassing on my private property. She got defensive and said the previous owners had always been grateful for her help with their yard maintenance. I made it crystal clear that I was not the previous owners, and she needed to stay off my property. That should have been the end of it, but Susan was just getting started. The final straw came when I planned a small barbecue with a few friends from work. I had bought this nice new patio set and a portable fire pit to make the backyard more entertaining friendly. It was going to be my first time really hosting people at the new house, and I was excited to show off my little paradise. Right in the middle of the party, with all my guests standing around enjoying themselves, Susan marched over with her husband in tow. She announced loudly that my fire pit was in violation of some 100-foot rule about open flames near the shared park area. She threatened to call the fire department right then and there if I didn't extinguish it immediately. Her husband just stood behind her nodding like one of those bobblehead dolls, clearly too intimidated by his wife to have his own opinion about anything. The whole scene was incredibly embarrassing. My friends were looking around awkwardly, not knowing what to do or say. I tried to explain that this was my private property and I had every right to have a fire pit in my own backyard, but Susan wasn't having any of it. She kept talking over me and making threats about fines and violations. Eventually, my friends started making excuses about needing to leave early, and my first attempt at entertaining in my new home was completely ruined. As I watched my friends pack up their things and head out, apologizing for the awkward situation, and Susan stood there with this smug look of victory on her face, I knew being polite was no longer an option. She had declared war on my peace and my property. She just didn't realize I was about to use her own rulebook to completely destroy her little kingdom. I spent the entire weekend doing research. First, I installed multiple high-definition security cameras covering every angle of my backyard. If Susan wanted to keep trespassing, I was going to have video evidence of every single incident. Then I sat down with the HOA covenants and spent hours reading every single page of fine print. These documents were incredibly detailed, and I quickly realized that Susan's obsession with rules was about to become her downfall. The HOA rules were very specific about fencing. Homeowners were allowed to install fences, but they had to be certain approved types and heights, and required committee approval. Since Susan was the head of the beautification committee, that meant she would have to personally approve or deny any fence application. Next, I hired a professional surveyor to come out and mark the exact property lines. This was the most important step in my plan. The surveyors came out on a Tuesday morning and spent several hours putting up bright orange flags marking every boundary point. The results were very interesting. It turned out that the actual property line extended about 2 feet further into the shared park area than everyone had assumed. That meant some of the beautiful rose bushes that Susan was so proud of maintaining were actually growing on my private property. Armed with this information, I submitted an official fence application to the HOA. I chose the most expensive, most robust, and tallest fence allowed by the covenants. A 6-foot-tall black wrought iron fence with decorative elements that met every single specification in their rules. In my application, I made sure to quote Susan's own violation notice word for word. I explained that this fence would ensure a properly maintained transition from private to communal space and would prevent any future confusion regarding landscaping responsibilities. I wrote that it would ensure the aesthetic integrity of the shared park was not compromised by my private property maintenance decisions. Susan received my application and was absolutely furious. She called me multiple times demanding that I withdraw the application, but I refused to take her calls. The beautiful thing was that she couldn't deny my request because it met every single written requirement in the covenants she was so obsessed with enforcing. If she denied an application that followed all the rules perfectly, it would be clear abuse of power and I could sue the HOA for discrimination. She had no choice but to approve it, probably thinking I couldn't afford such an expensive fence or wouldn't actually follow through with the installation. She was wrong on both counts. The fence installation began on a Monday morning and took the entire week. The construction crew was professional and efficient, and the fence they installed was absolutely beautiful. It was solid black wrought iron with decorative spear points at the top and matched the upscale aesthetic of the neighborhood perfectly. More importantly, it completely blocked the open view from the park into my backyard. The days of Susan being able to wander through my private space whenever she felt like it were officially over. On Wednesday, when the crew reached the section where Susan's beloved rose bushes were growing on my property according to the survey, They had to carefully dig them up to install the fence posts. I made sure to instruct them to be very gentle with the plants since I had plans for them. That's when Susan completely lost it. She came running out of her house screaming when she saw her precious roses being moved. She started yelling at the construction workers to stop immediately and demanding to know who had authorized them to touch her landscaping. I walked over calmly with my approved fence application and the official property survey in hand. I explained to her that I was simply following all the rules she had taught me about maintaining proper boundaries between private and communal space. I was taking full responsibility for my property, exactly like she had always wanted. The look on her face was priceless. She tried to argue that those roses had been there for years and were part of the community landscaping, but the survey clearly showed they were on my side of the property line. There was nothing she could do about it. Later that afternoon, after the fence crew had finished for the day, I took those carefully preserved rose bushes and replanted them on my side of the fence. Now Susan could see her former pride and joy through the black iron bars, but she could never touch them again. To complete my masterpiece, I installed a small tasteful sign on the new fence gate that read, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted. Smile, you're on camera." The fallout was immediate and extremely satisfying. Susan was livid, but there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The fence met every single requirement in the HOA covenants. The roses were clearly on my property according to the official survey, and I had followed all proper procedures for approval. Even better, Susan started getting violation notices herself for the damaged turf on the communal side where the fence installation had disturbed the grass. As head of the beautification committee, she was now responsible for maintaining that area to community standards. The other neighbors started talking about what had happened, and several of them came over to congratulate me on finally standing up to Susan's controlling behavior. Apparently, she had been making everyone's life difficult for years, but nobody had ever figured out how to fight back effectively. Her power on the beautification committee was completely destroyed. She had been so easily outmaneuvered by the very rules she had weaponized against everyone else. People stopped taking her seriously, and her authority in the neighborhood crumbled almost overnight. For the first time since moving in, I finally had the peace and privacy I had been looking for. My backyard was now a true sanctuary where I could relax without worrying about Susan wandering through whenever she felt like critiquing my landscaping choices. I started hosting regular barbecues and get-togethers, and my friends were amazed by the transformation. The fence had turned my yard into this private oasis that felt completely separate from the community drama, but I wasn't done yet. I decided to get more involved in the HOA, not to become a tyrant like Susan, but to make sure nobody else would have to go through what I had experienced. I started building relationships with other neighbors who were tired of Susan's reign of terror. At the next annual meeting, Susan was voted out of her position on the beautification committee. The new leadership focused on reasonable community standards instead of petty power trips and arbitrary aesthetic demands. The story ends with me enjoying my morning coffee in my beautiful private backyard, looking at those rose bushes that are now definitely mine. Sometimes I catch Susan glaring at me from her window, probably still furious about losing control of her little neighborhood kingdom. Whenever I see her watching, I make sure to give her a friendly wave and a smile. It's a small gesture, but it represents something much bigger. The complete and total victory of someone who refused to be bullied in their own home. The fence still stands as a monument to the power of malicious compliance, and my yard has never looked better. Update. 6 months later. The sweet taste of complete victory. I thought my story with Susan was over after the fence went up, but apparently she wasn't quite ready to accept defeat. The past 6 months have been absolutely wild, and I figured you all deserve to hear how everything played out in the end. About 2 weeks after my original post, Susan made one last desperate attempt to regain control. She somehow convinced her husband to file a complaint with the city claiming my fence was a safety hazard and violated local building codes. The city inspector showed up on a Thursday morning while I was working from home. I was actually excited to see him because I knew my fence was completely legal. I had all the permits, the HOA approval, and the professional installation certificates ready to go. The inspector spent about 30 minutes looking at everything and concluded that not only was my fence perfectly legal, but it was actually one of the best installations he had seen in the area. The really satisfying part came when he asked me about the complaint. I showed him my security camera footage of Susan trespassing on my property multiple times before the fence went up. He was not amused that someone had wasted city resources filing a frivolous complaint and said he would be noting that in his report. Apparently, Susan got a nice letter from the city about misuse of municipal services and the potential consequences of filing false reports. Her husband was reportedly furious with her for dragging him into her petty neighborhood drama. Things escalated again when Susan decided to start a whisper campaign about how my fence was ruining property values. She was going around telling anyone who would listen that I was some kind of anti-social hermit who was destroying the community spirit with my fortress mentality. This backfired spectacularly. 3 different neighbors came to me privately to share what she had been saying, and they were all disgusted by her behavior. Turns out Susan had been bullying people for years, and my successful resistance had inspired others to start pushing back too. The neighbor directly across from Susan started parking his work truck in his driveway overnight, something she had apparently been harassing him about for months. Another family put up a playset for their kids that Susan had previously tried to ban for being too colorful. It was like the whole neighborhood was suddenly free to live their lives without her constant interference. The breaking point came during the spring HOA meeting. Susan, despite being voted out of the beautification committee, still tried to dominate the proceedings. She stood up and launched into this long rant about how I was setting a dangerous precedent and encouraging antisocial behavior that would destroy property values. That's when Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, stood up and told Susan to sit down and shut up. She said that Susan had been making everyone miserable for years and that the neighborhood was finally peaceful now that people could enjoy their own properties without constant harassment. Several other neighbors chimed in with their own stories about Susan's controlling behavior. One family shared how she had tried to dictate what color they could paint their front door. Another neighbor talked about how she had actually called the police on their teenager for skateboarding in their own driveway. By the end of the meeting, Susan was completely humiliated. The new HOA board formally censured her for her past behavior and warned her that any further harassment of neighbors would result in legal action by the association itself. But the real victory came when a realtor friend of mine told me what happened when Susan's house went on the market 3 months ago. Apparently she couldn't handle living across from someone who had so thoroughly defeated her, so she decided to move. Here's the beautiful irony though. My fence actually increased property values in our section of the neighborhood. The realtor said buyers loved the privacy and security it provided, and several families specifically mentioned how professional and well-maintained it looked. Susan's house, on the other hand, sat on the market for 2 months before she had to drop the price significantly. The new family that bought Susan's house is absolutely wonderful. They have 2 young kids who love playing in their backyard, and the parents actually thanked me for installing the fence because it gives them extra privacy too. The kids sometimes wave at me through the fence slats, and I've started growing extra vegetables to share with them. Last month, the HOA voted to amend the community covenants to include stronger protections for property owners against harassment. They specifically added language preventing committee members from entering private property without permission and requiring all violation notices to cite specific, clearly defined rule violations. I've been elected to the HOA board myself now, and my first initiative was establishing a mediation process for neighbor disputes. Instead of letting petty tyrants like Susan run wild, we now have a fair system for addressing legitimate concerns while protecting people from harassment. The most satisfying moment came last week when I was working in my garden and noticed someone watching me from the street. It was Susan, apparently back for a visit with the new owners. She stood there for about 5 minutes just staring at my beautiful, thriving garden behind my gorgeous fence. I looked up, gave her the biggest smile I could manage, and waved enthusiastically. She quickly looked away and hurried back to her car. As she drove off, I couldn't help but laugh thinking about how this woman who once thought she owned the entire neighborhood was now reduced to lurking around like a tourist in her former domain. My roses, the ones she used to control, are blooming better than ever. I've expanded the garden significantly and even added a small greenhouse that's visible from what used to be her house. Every plant I add feels like another small victory. The fence still gets compliments from neighbors and visitors. What started as a defensive move to protect my property has become a symbol of standing up for yourself and refusing to be bullied. Several other neighbors have installed similar fencing, creating a more private and peaceful atmosphere throughout the area. I've learned that sometimes the best way to deal with controlling people is to use their own obsession with rules against them. Susan thought she could weaponize the HOA covenants to control everyone around her, but she never considered that someone might actually read those rules more carefully than she did. These days, my backyard truly is the peaceful sanctuary I dreamed of when I bought the house. I host barbecues regularly, and my friends still joke about the dramatic transformation from that first awkward party. The security cameras are still recording, but now they mainly capture footage of me relaxing in my hammock or tending to my ever-expanding garden. Susan's reign of terror is over, the neighborhood is more peaceful than it's been in years, and my property values have actually increased thanks to the improvements I've made. Sometimes standing your ground and fighting back intelligently really does pay off in every possible way. The moral of the story remains the same. Don't let bullies intimidate you, especially when they're using made-up authority to justify their behavior. Read the rules, know your rights, and never be afraid to use someone's own tactics against them when they're clearly in the wrong. My fence stands tall, my garden grows beautifully, and Susan is just a bad memory that occasionally drives by to remind herself of the kingdom she lost through her own arrogance and entitlement. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Warning: this is a long read, but the comments indicate it may be worth your time to read. I regretfully got an apartment with what is in my opinion the worst landlord ever. This man, I will call entitled prick or ED, has the audacity to call himself a good person in court. Let me fill you in. I got an apartment shortly after being released from prison, happy that someone was going to give me a chance to improve my life. This was clearly not the case. All was well for the first few months, then winter hit and the heat went out. It took 3 days to get ED to even answer his phone. By that time, his voicemail was full of complaints from his freezing cold tenants. He told me the law gave him reasonable time to fix it. We went 2 more weeks with no heat using our stoves and camping in the kitchen in our respective apartments. When ED got his electricity bill, he attempted to raise the rent on the apartments. Obviously, he was not allowed by the city, so he refused to pay his electricity bill, thus denying all of us heat at all. This is where my OCD kicked in and I went full research mode. I studied every law in regards to federal, state, and city landlord-tenant laws and rights. I found so many violations it was no longer funny but scary. I studied building code. I studied the condition of all of his apartments. This was easier due to the fact I was either friends with his tenants or had gone there to repair damages caused by frozen pipes and electrical outlets failing due to shoddy wiring and so forth. ED had pissed off all of his tenants. Every last one was pissed to the point where they wanted to testify against him in court, but couldn't due to the financial hardships the living conditions we were in had been causing. I formulated a plan to get him to repair the buildings he owned. But ED had his own plan. January 2nd at 2 a.m. I was awoken by the smoke detectors in the whole building going off. I quickly ran to the back hall because no smoke was in my apartment yet, but I was on the top floor. I opened the door and was greeted by a thick wall of smoke. I quickly ran downstairs after shouting for my GF at the time to get out of the house quick. I pounded on every door and screamed fire. I got as many people as possible to evacuate, but the floor with the fire no one was answering, and to my knowledge contained children, so I panicked. At this point, the fire department was there and began breaking in doors. I evacuated. After the fire was out and the investigation had started, I witnessed ED give the tenant of that apartment's sister an envelope containing an undisclosed amount of cash which was visible to anyone nearby. 2 weeks later, the results were released. Arson! The tenant had used hairspray to start the fire and hid the evidence in a hole she punched into the wall. The very person who had been given money by the landlord. Ironically, she was the only tenant who had paid rent in the whole building because she had started moving in 2 days prior. I had not known she was now a tenant, and her sister and kids had moved out the day before. I looked at ED and told him I know what he had done, and I was not going to rest until he lost all his buildings. I then began asking his tenants for their stories about their interaction with ED. This is where things got real. He had been accused of everything from ripping off employees, theft, grand theft auto, bank fraud, and so much more. I formulated a new plan. I sucked up to him and made it known I am a computer tech. ED had a few broken computers and some printer and network issues. I was in. We worked a deal on payment for back rent. I knew he was not good for his word, but it was all part of the plan. Once I got his passwords and logins, I copied his entire HDD to my portable one. I copied all emails in his business account and printed his financial records on my Wi-Fi printer, which was next door. After I fixed his computers and network, I then went home to review my newfound evidence. It was enough. More than enough. I contacted code enforcement with all of the violations of code for every building, including the illegal electrical installation in his new office without permits or even an electrician. He was immediately investigated. That night, I found a 7-day notice to quit on my door. My roommate was worried, but I filled him in on the plan. Remember I studied all those laws and rights? Well, we get to court, and I open with your honor I have proof of a clear violation of the warranty of Habitability Act. The eviction was thrown out, and he was forced to repair my apartment with me, still in it, immediately. The next month, I was given another eviction notice. Still, he is losing money due to the fact I was teaching his tenants landlord-tenant rights and the laws associated with it. ED kept losing his court dates and kept being told to fix stuff, and was continuously fined by the courts and the code enforcement. He was sinking fast. Back to that fire, the woman living there was arrested for arson and charged with 2 counts due to the accidental electrical fire on New Year's Day. Turned out to be ruled intentional, so the hairspray was in reality attempt 2. He was under investigation for conspiracy to arson and other charges. I wasn't done yet. We went to court again for my non-payment of rent. I won again based on the Landlord Retaliation Act because I had contacted code enforcement and can prove this blatant retaliation, and the judge didn't even listen to ED. Needless to say, spending the winter without heat took a toll on us tenants. We bought electric heaters and informed the power company that the landlord had shut off all the power to all his building and was requiring the tenants to pay for their own power. Well, apparently his illegal wiring caught up to him. He had wired apartments to run off each other, and the common areas were now attached to wiring in every apartment. This put ED in a rough position, as local law says it's the landlord's responsibility to supply power to all common areas. This means his shoddy workmanship and illegal wiring prevents him from legally disconnecting the power. The power company turned on all the power and locked his ability to shut it off until the wiring of common areas was repaired and separated from the apartments. This would cost thousands. Thousands we knew he didn't have. ED was panicking. He kept losing in court, people were legally withholding rent, he couldn't shut off services, and the fines were debilitating. He kept blaming his tenants and refused to repair things. One by one, the buildings were condemned, and ED was required to pay for relocation of his tenants by law. Well, he didn't. He couldn't. He was arrested for attempting to sell 3 buildings the city confiscated from him, and for selling one that was condemned. ED got what he deserved. He lost every building he owned, got charged with all kinds of fraud, and was investigated for other crimes I am still unaware of. But I wasn't done. He caused a lot of suffering. I gave his financial records to the IRS with all the internal memos and everything I got from his computers. Also, I provided the local authorities and code enforcement with the same things. ED was so screwed. I have since gotten a new apartment, and everything he owned has been taken by the city, state, and IRS. I have not seen ED in 3 years, and all of his properties have been bought by someone new, repaired, and have all new tenants who are happy with their new landlords. The old tenants got better places with decent landlords. And what about our wonderful entitled Dick? He is serving multiple sentences for the crimes he has committed and is already not getting out anytime soon, yet the investigations are not done and the charges keep coming. ED is somewhere in some prison regretting meeting this tenant. Moral? Don't be an ED unless you want to meet the moral enforcer. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So this happened a while back with a large Australian hospital. The Friday before Xmas senior management dropped the dreaded restructure notice, standard spiel about realignment, better patient outcomes, efficient practice, blah blah blah. They give notice to the staff and unions that consultation closes first week of January. The new employment structure will take place in February. Under the conditions of our industrial award, the employer must make genuine consultation available where the employee has the opportunity to change the employer's mind about making them redundant. The other thing is, redundancy payouts are generally good in health in Australia, with a worker with 13 years work history gets a year's pay with $113,000 tax-free, plus entitlements such as annual leave and long service leave paid out. Each year you work, your redundancy increases in value to a maximum of 13 years. About 5%, 200 plus of staff are going to be made redundant. The union launches into the industrial court, arguing that the time given, especially over Xmas, is insufficient. The court agrees and extends the time by 2 weeks, but issues 2 statements. 1. The industrial court will not slow down this restructure anymore, and 2. It strongly reminds the unions, there was multiple, that you can only consult. Hospital management see this as a big win and are bragging how they are going beat us. The unions have a combined meeting and decide that if the staff can only consult, then ask as many questions as we can. The members are asked to field as many questions as possible. My union alone gather 1,200 plus questions, with 700 of them unique. Another 800, 900 questions coming from the other unions. As you can imagine, management does not respond well to our combined 2,000 plus questions. They attempt to push on. We head back to court where we remind the judge of his must-consult orders. The court tells our employer that they must answer the questions. The restructure is on hold by court order. What were the questions like? Some questions were about legal ramifications due to industrial award requirements, others about professional legal standards, some questions about day-to-day operations, and others about how they would be personally impacted. The court orders both sides to meet back in a month, and hospital management must answer all questions. We get our answers in 3 weeks' time that consist of yes, no, maybe, possibly, and unsure answers. All one-word answers. This is not genuine consultation. We head back to court, and the judge is furious about lack of real consultation. The hospital argue it's too many questions to answer, but the judge reminds them they only have to genuinely consult. Come June, we are in a legal holding pattern when hospital management declares that they are changing the restructure on feedback given and issues new restructure papers. The restructure will take place in 4 weeks' time. New restructure requires new consultation, which the hospital isn't willing to do. Back to court, the unions go to remind the judge about genuine consultation. We won again by just consulting. Come December, 1 year after starting all of this, the hospital hires a consultant to get the restructure done. She has the same attitude as hospital management and tries to rush through the restructure without genuine consultation. We head back to court, and at this stage, the judge has had enough and notes the unions have played by the rules and the hospital hasn't. We hit back with even more questions, and judge decides he will set down monthly meetings with him, chairing them to work through this mess. In total, the restructure takes over 3 years with loss of a lot less jobs lost than expected. In fact, it was a fraction of jobs expected to go. In some departments, we gained jobs by arguing about workloads, etc. The vast majority of people who lost their jobs were close to retirement age and received a handsome payout. They also got 3+ years pay as the restructure took place over that time. Some of the union's members had worked less than the 13 years work history maximum payout before the restructure. The 3+ years of delay increased their payouts. All we did was consult by asking questions as the judge ordered. Anyway, thank you for watching.